Shall we begin? So, the plan is for tomorrow, the lecture to be at 10 o'clock in the morning. Is this okay with everyone? 10 o'clock? Not too early for philosophy? It's a very strange thing, this idea that one should pick a day and a time and say, at this time we will do philosophy. Plato or Socrates would have thought this is ridiculous. Philosophy is something that must come. Sometimes it's the right time, sometimes it's the wrong time. To do philosophy at a particular time is like planning always to make love at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning, 4 o'clock on Tuesday. There's something contradictory about it. But the university or the instituto demands that we can do philosophy at a particular time. So tomorrow, 10 o'clock in the morning, you must be in the mood for philosophy. I'm sorry. This is the strange nature of the modern world. So, yesterday, I said I was going to give you a partial taxonomy of varieties of skepticism. And I offered you two varieties. I mentioned that I think there are more, but I mentioned two varieties. I called them Cartesian and Kantian skepticism. And I gave you various ways to distinguish them conceptually. I gave you a kind of conceptual way of seeing the difference. Now, what I want to do to begin with today is to make the distinction more practical. So if you pick up a book of philosophy and you open it up and you want to know, is this Cartesian or Kantian problematic according to Conant? I want to say enough so that you can answer this question without having to ask Conant. You can just do it yourself. So I'm going to do this by, in this sense, giving you a more fine-grained way of discriminating the two varieties. And I'll do this by distinguishing what I'll call generic features. There's more or less generic features. My full list of generic features is a very stupid number. It's 23 generic features I found. But in the handout I give you 9 generic features. I think this is enough. If it's less than 9, I think it's a little hard to see the difference. But I find with these 9 we can already get a pretty rich way of distinguishing the two varieties. But I want to make it clear that this number 9 is arbitrary. We can extend the features. Also, it's arbitrary in a different way. I don't think the features are really all completely distinct from each other. They're different aspects of a single problematic, but one might be more prominent than another. And I've tried to arrange the 9 features in each case so that there's a kind of dialectical relation to them. One leads to the next. So what we'll do is explore these 9 generic features. I say generic features because, as I said last time, I'm now thinking of these two varieties of skepticism not as kinds of skepticism that have sharp boundaries. Either it's one or it's the other. But rather, as I put it, as genres of skepticism, in the way we use genre in aesthetics when we speak of comedy or tragedy or melodrama. A genre is not a strict distinction. Genres can be mixed. And these genres of skepticism also can be mixed in various ways. What it means to mix them is something we have to think about. But as a matter of sociological fact, if you open a work of philosophy, sometimes you find a mixing of these features. What that means is it's philosophically interesting, and we will think about that. But as a matter of fact, you can find this. So the two varieties can be distinguished as ideal types of problematic in their purity. But in practice, what one finds is not always, as Plato says, the ideal in its pure form, but sometimes in corrupted form. So we will explore this. But before I go through the 9 features of each genre of skepticism, I want to make some caveats. That even these 9 features involve idealization. I'm simplifying, I'm idealizing these genres. And there's various dimensions of idealization. at least two independent dimensions. The first dimension lies in the idea that what Cartesian skepticism is, say, is some problematic that has all 9 features. If it has all 9 features, then, as I will put it, it's a fully realized variant, Cartesian skepticism. If it has all 9 features of Kantian skepticism, then I will say it's a fully realized variant of Kantian skepticism. But many of the actual books you encounter will have some of these features without others. So they won't, on the page, be in this way fully realized. What I do want to say is, if the author is clear about his problem, he will see that some of the features lead to others, that his problem really has all these features. But I'm not saying every author is clear about his problem. So this is an idealization because I think most philosophical discussions, though if they exhibit any one of these features, they will exhibit some of them, they will not necessarily exhibit all of them. That's just a fact about what's out there. So, when I speak of a Cartesian problematic and a Kantian problematic today, I can be more careful about what I meant than yesterday. Today, when I speak of a Cartesian problematic or a Kantian problematic, what I mean is a philosophical discussion that exhibits a large number of these features. To be Cartesian or to be Kantian, there is therefore a matter of degree. If it exhibits 5 or 6 features, it is very Cartesian. If it exhibits 7 or 8 features, it's extremely Cartesian. But this is not a matter of all or nothing. It's a matter of degrees. So the more features of a given problematic a philosophical discussion exhibits, the more Cartesian, or the more Kantian it is. Now, that's the first dimension of idealization. The second dimension of idealization has to do with the way in which, as I explained it yesterday, these feature spaces seem completely distinct, that they didn't overlap. Whereas, I think if you look at actual philosophical texts, and this came up in my answer to Matteo's question yesterday, that you can find kinds of overlap. And we'll be discussing what the overlap means. But I will, for a while, talk today as if there was no overlap. And then we will think about the overlap, if we have time. Okay. The reason I speak of these as genres, when I say Cartesian genre of skepticism or Kantian genre of skepticism, I also want to think of these, to borrow another term from aesthetics, as adjacent genres. So, what happens if you look at my 9 Cartesian features on your handout, and then the 9 Kantian features, I think what you'll notice is, although the features are different, we will see this more in a moment, they're related somehow. I will speak of there being a displacement of the feature. What happens is not something as simple as a negation of the feature, but it's somehow changed, twisted, a displacement. And I think if we could look at more varieties of skepticism, so for instance, if we could consider, say, 3 varieties, Pyrrhonian, Cartesian, Kantian, and we looked at the features, you would see each time a displacement. And so once we have the features in front of us, a question we can also ask, a very interesting and difficult question, I think, is about the character of the displacement. I think one thing we can say about the character of the displacement is that there's a kind of radicalization of the problematic as we move from Pyrrhonian to Cartesian, Cartesian to Kantian. But what does this mean, radicalization? That is something not clear, I think, from that word. It's something else to explore. And so I say genres because I think in aesthetics we have a more useful model than we do. When philosophers like to speak of kinds, genera, species, I don't think this is useful vocabulary for thinking about these varieties of skepticism. That's why my title has the word varieties. It's intentionally vague. And then the question is, what kind of varieties are these varieties? One thing you could ask from my lecture yesterday, are these varieties of skepticism kinds of skepticism? That's a possible view. My own view, which I'll be suggesting tomorrow, is that's the wrong answer. No, they're not kinds. Kinds suggests no possibility of overlap. A dog and a cat are different kinds of animal. Nothing can be a dog and a cat at the same time. This is not how these varieties are related. So I think genre is a much better word. If you think about, say, genres of movie, like a Western and a romantic comedy, usually they're different, but you can have a Western that's a comedy. Usually it's not a very good movie. It's difficult to make an aesthetically interesting work that mingles genres. Usually the results are aesthetically distasteful, but there's no conceptual barrier to mixing them. In principle, you could have a very good movie that's a Western and a comedy. In practice, it turns out not to be so easy. So similarly here, I think the mingling of these genres of skepticism tend to be philosophically jarring and confused, but not because they can't be mingled. So in philosophy, when you get a mingling of my features, once you have my 9 Cartesian features and my 9 Kantian features, if you look at a work and notice that it exhibits both, that, I'm going to suggest, is itself a philosophically interesting symptom, which itself can provoke interesting questions. We will come back to this. One last preliminary remark. I thought I would, again, say something more about why I call these first 9 features of something that should be labeled Cartesian skepticism, and why I call the second set of 9 features of something that should be called Kantian skepticism. My use of these words, Cartesian and Kantian, is not obvious. We saw last time that I want to count as variants of Cartesian skepticism problems that Descartes never was concerned with, and similarly for Kantian skepticism. And also, I think there are variants of Kantian skepticism that are already present in Descartes. And Kant himself is certainly concerned to address Cartesian skepticism. So why use these labels, you might think? This is just to confuse you. But I think there is a point. I will try to put it this way. Even though I think something like a Kantian problematic is present in Descartes, the place I think you see it most clearly in Descartes is in his discussion of the problem of the creation of eternal truths. When Descartes starts thinking about the problem, what if God had made it the case that 2 and 2 makes 5? The problem that he gets into there stops having a Cartesian form that we discussed yesterday with the features we're about to discuss. It starts to have a Kantian form about what would it be to think something in some other way than in accordance with our forms of thought. Descartes says this is a possibility we can touch in thought, we can apprehend in thought, but not embrace in thought, not comprehend. Only God could do that. I've written an article about this. It's called The Search for Logically Alien Thought. That article is about, one way to describe the topic of that article in the vocabulary of these lectures is to say it's about the beginnings of a Kantian problematic in early modern philosophy with Descartes. So that problem in Descartes is not a problem with the Cartesian form. Similarly, Kant is very concerned with Cartesian skepticism. The refutation of idealism is his treatment of Cartesian skepticism. But his treatment of Cartesian skepticism comes after his treatment of Kantian skepticism. And it can only be resolved once one's first seen what's wrong with the person he calls the skeptic. So it's the reason for these labels is not because this problem is present in Descartes and not the other, this problem is present in Kant and not the other. That would be a misunderstanding. No truth to that at all. Don't mean to suggest that. Rather, I call these problematics Cartesian and Kantian, respectively, not in order to mark the first point at which they appear in philosophy. You've seen that can't be right. Nor the last point in which they are important. That's not true. They're both still very important today, I'm arguing, when I discuss, for instance, the philosophy of language case, or the philosophy of mind case, or the aesthetics case that you have on your handout earlier. So, it's not for these reasons. Rather, I call them Cartesian and Kantian, respectively, because I think it's with Descartes that we have the first historical moment in which one variant of Cartesian skepticism becomes fully visible and exhibits all of its features, including all 9 of the features I have on the handout. That's the first moment where you find all 9 features present in a discussion of this problematic. And similarly, I call the second problematic Kantian because I think it's, although Hume is very concerned with a couple of variants of Kantian skepticism, it's first with Kant that you find someone clearly thinking the problem through to the point where it exhibits all 9 features I will discuss in a moment of what I'm calling Kantian skepticism. So that's the reason for the label. It's not the beginning, it's not the end, it's the moment in which the first variant is fully present. That, I think, means each of them deserves a certain kind of importance in the history of philosophy for this achievement of clarity. So that's the reason for the label. Okay, so with all these cautionary remarks in mind, they're genres, they're idealized, they come in degrees, they can overlap, and the labels name the first full flower of a variant. With all of that in mind, I now give you, on page 4 of the handout, 9 Cartesian features. So the first feature, I say, is that the Cartesian investigation begins with and turns on the exploration of a very special sort of example, what I'm going to call a best case of knowledge. So whether it's the case in philosophy of art you have on your handout, or philosophy of action, or philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, philosophy of perception, it will count as Cartesian, whether it's in the 17th century or the 21st century. One of the features it must have is that it starts with the right kind of example. If I say, as I said yesterday, is that a spider over there, 15 meters away? And I say, that's a spider. And then you say, no, it's not a spider. It can't be a spider. And I'm wrong. It's not a spider. Then I'm just wrong. The conclusion is Professor Conant did not know there was a spider. Or if I say, and the reason I didn't know it's a spider in this case is because the conditions are not optimal. I'm looking at a light. It's 15 feet away. So first, for it to count as the best case of knowledge, the conditions must be fine. The lighting must be fine. It must be at close range. Those are features of a best case of knowledge. But there are many other things that go into a best case of knowledge. A full discussion of this would take some time, but I will mention a few things quickly. But what we will see about a best case of knowledge is that the example must be carefully selected. To generate a Cartesian problematic, you must choose the right sort of example. And it's this homology of structure across areas of philosophy in the structure of the example that's part of what interests me in exploring what I'm calling the logic of Cartesian skepticism. So, I'll give you 4 characteristics of the example. The first is that the example has to at least appear to involve a concrete claim to know. A claim. That's how it starts. It doesn't start by saying, what is the nature of sense perception? What Descartes says is, I appear for all the world to be sitting in front of the fireplace in my dressing gown. We have an example. And then we introduce a problem with the example. But I might be dreaming. But the problem that's introduced about Descartes' example is a problem such that if I don't know I'm sitting in front of the fireplace, then the conclusion is not, oh, Professor Descartes doesn't know he's in front of the fireplace. The conclusion is, we can't know anything by means of the senses. So the example itself has generality built into it. So we start with a concrete claim to know, if it's a Cartesian example. That is, a claim that a particular person at a particular time, at a particular place enters. But at the same time, because it's a best case of knowledge, the example serves as an exemplar of an entire class of claims of knowledge. If it's philosophy of perception, if we don't know this, we know nothing by means of the senses. If it's the problem of other minds, if I don't know in this situation whether he's in pain, I can't ever know what someone is thinking or feeling. And so on for each of my areas. So the structure of the example must have a kind of, we could say, representativeness built into it. It must be sufficiently representative so that each of us can rehearse a version of that claim, if you will, in the privacy of our own epistemological closet. I'm not in front of the fireplace with the dressing gown. But this does not mean that Cartesian skepticism is not possible for me, or I need to first get a fireplace, which is not so easy to do in Chicago, and then get a dressing gown, and then start to be. I can create another example. I am standing in front of an audience in Naples. This seems to be a best case of knowledge. But what if I'm dreaming? And I can rehearse this example for myself. And it has this, as long as it has the same structure, it obeys the same logic, then we have something that has a Cartesian structure. What makes it Cartesian skepticism is the iterability of this structure, starting with the best case. There's other things about the character of the object we select to make our example that are important for it to be Cartesian skepticism. A first way to put this would be to say it must be a very unremarkable object. You can only get Cartesian skepticism if your example, for instance, requires no special sort of expertise to be able to tell one if you see one. So, the kind of object that figures in Cartesian examples of, say, philosophy of perception are things like a hand, G.E. Moore, a tomato, H.H. Price, an envelope, G.E. Moore again, someone lecturing to an audience. A chair is a very popular example in analytic philosophy. But an envelope, a tomato, a chair, a hand must be this kind of object. Not an M16 rifle, or a 9-iron, or a Japanese beetle, or a goldfinch, or a nuclear fission tube, or a bubble chamber. If I say, I think that's a Japanese beetle, and you say, there are no Japanese beetles, and maybe in Chicago there are Japanese beetles, but in Naples there's no Japanese beetle. That's a perfectly ordinary Italian beetle. Then the conclusion is, I didn't know it was a Japanese beetle. I'm sorry. John Austin has a famous example that Cavell discusses where, someone says, that's a goldfinch. And then someone says, how do you know it's a goldfinch? Because it has a red head. Goldcrest has a red head too. Oh yeah? I guess I don't know it's a goldfinch. It looks like a goldfinch, but maybe it's not a goldfinch. That's the conclusion. And then Austin says, some philosophers are prone to argue that because sometimes I don't know, I never know. But this is completely unfair to someone who has a Cartesian problem. The person who has the Cartesian problem does not argue because sometimes I don't know, I never know. He starts with a completely different kind of example. Austin's examples, like goldfinches, are all examples that require some expertise. The Cartesian example is always the tomato, the chair, the fireplace, under perfect conditions. If I don't know that, I don't need to then take an extra step to say, well, sometimes I don't know, but maybe. There's a much deeper problem. Finally, so you have to start with the right sort of example, as I might put it, to get the Cartesian problematic up and running. Even the first feature, I'm only discussing one feature. I will discuss the first feature in more detail and the others, don't worry. But I want you to already see, even to enter it, there's actually quite a bit of structure that's required. And yet, at the same time, we find this structure over and over again in philosophy, in different areas of philosophy. So although there's a tremendous amount of detail, the detail recurs. And this should interest us. Stanley Cavell, in The Claim of Reason, speaks in this context of there being a special sort of object that figures in what he calls skepticism. And he says it's a generic object. This is not what I call skepticism, but what I call Cartesian skepticism. It's more local. And I will say something about this. But generic object means that the object itself has this representative character, as I put it. Now, finally, one more feature is all I'll mention about the Cartesian examples, which is, I've already said this, but I want to really emphasize this. It must be encountered under optimal conditions. If it's 50 feet away, or if my eyesight is bad, or if anything like that is the reason, I don't know. We don't generalize. The conditions under which the objects are encountered are such that nothing like that can defeat my claim. It must be something like, so the ground we give for knowledge is not, well, I can tell a goldfinch when I see one. I can tell a tomato when I see one. The ground we're considering now is a completely different kind of ground. If it's perception, it's by means of the senses. It's the philosophy of mind case we discussed it yesterday. How do you know he's in pain? By means of his behavior. If that's the ground, the threat to the ground has much greater consequences. But we can only get such a threat to such a ground if the initial conditions that we imagine for the example are ideal. So the philosopher is always asking a question, but do you really know? Precisely in a context in which, in everyday life, we want to ask that question. I'm not saying that as an objection, but merely as a description of the structure of Cartesian skepticism. The question is in that way extraordinary. So, if we wanted to really explore the Cartesian problematic, one thing we could do would explore the character and the legitimacy of these kinds of examples. The kinds of examples you need to employ to introduce a Cartesian skeptical recital. And one way to criticize Cartesian skepticism is to criticize the structure of the examples. Austin does this in one way, Cavell worries about this in another way, and so on. You have many people worrying about the example. Is this really, G.E. Moore, is this really an okay example? What should we say about the example? But if you have someone like Moore, or Austin, or Cavell, trying to stop the Cartesian problematic by worrying about the example, they are in the space of what I'm calling Cartesian skepticism. This is all part of the problematic. It's a sign that you're in the problematic, that you're worried about the integrity of the example in this way. Remember, skepticism for me is not the name of a position the skeptic holds. It's the name of the problematic that is generated by attempt to respond to the problem. Second feature, speed it up a little bit. I say, so first we start with what I call best case of knowledge. The second feature is then to show, even though we have a best case of knowledge, it is nonetheless open to doubt. So we move from the example to a doubt about the example. And I said some things yesterday about what you must do to generate a Cartesian doubt. I think the most abstract way I know of putting it is to say you must generate a problem of indistinguishability. If we're doing philosophy of perception, you say, yes, 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 it seems like you're lecturing in a class in Naples, but what if you were dreaming and you were in bed in the Hotel Royal Continental still? It would seem exactly like you were lecturing. There is no way to distinguish from the inside whether you're waking or dreaming. In the case of other minds, we say, yes, he seems to be in pain, but if he's pretending to be in pain, the behavior would be exactly the same. So what's indistinguishable now is not my inner experience, but the outer behavior. If it's a problem in the philosophy of language, we say, yes, this looks exactly like an arrow. It's telling you to go a certain kind of way. But And we come up with an example in which the structure of the physical sign is the same, but the correct interpretation is different. In Kripke's version of the problem, in philosophy of language, we discussed it yesterday, we look at the performances of use up to a certain point in time. My performances and your performances are the same for that stretch of time. But what we will do next might be different. If I'm adding and you're quadding, at a certain point in the future, we will say something different. So in the one case, the indistinguishabilia are here. In another case, the indistinguishabilia are there on the surface of his body. In a third case, they're on the sign. In a fourth case, they're in a series of performances in the past as opposed to the future. In the philosophy of art case, I imagine we have something that's just dropped on the floor, and then we have something that looks just like it, but it's in a museum, and it says Andy Warhol. We have the same object, and we ask, but what is art? What must we add to the thing that is indistinguishable to make it art? But each of these cases has the same Cartesian structure. It starts with something that has the form of an argument from indistinguishability. That might not be clear, but I think you can see that structure in each case. And so then once you realize that, what happens next is then a question about a doubt. And so what the Cartesian tends to do is they ask, what can I doubt here and what can't I doubt? So if it's the philosophy of perception case, the Cartesian says, what in my experience can't I doubt? Well, I can't doubt that it seems a certain way to me. That my experience is as if I were lecturing in Naples. I can't doubt that. That's my experience. Whether I'm actually in a classroom lecturing, that goes beyond what I can be certain of. That involves a step. I can doubt that. And so then you get a principled division of the subject matter into that which cannot be doubted and that which can be doubted. And then the Cartesian constructive task, if you're trying to answer a Cartesian problematic, is often to say, how can I get from the indubitable to a claim about the dubitable? Descartes wanted God's help. Some analytic philosophers want a construction. They want to construct that out of this. But the form of the problem is always first a separation of the realm of ontology into the one thing and the other. It's philosophy of perception. That which is in the mind is indubitable. That which is in the world, in res extensa, is dubitable. Then how do I do it? So the doubt itself introduces a principle of discrimination, that which can be doubted. So we get a decomposition of being into two sorts of elements. If it's philosophy of perception, we get a decomposition of experience into two sorts of elements. Those that are inherently indubitable, the mental, and those that are in principle dubitable, that involve some element of risk in our claims about them. Third feature. If we start with the best case of knowledge, and we show the best case of knowledge is vulnerable to doubt, then as I said, the conclusion is not, I guess Professor Conant doesn't know that. The conclusion is general about us, not just Professor Conant, and about a whole strata of knowledge. If it's philosophy of perception, knowledge based on the senses. So, such a doubt, if it can be executed, directed at a best case of knowledge, generalizes. It's the third feature. Usually you have to have at least the first three features for something to really count as Cartesian problematic for me. It's very hard to take the first step without the second, and to take the second step without the third. So this discovery, so there's kind of discovery, which we will discuss in this third feature. And the discovery is that there's a generalization. So often if you're reading classic instances of Cartesian skepticism, there'll be a sort of aha moment. The philosopher has seen through our experience. In our ordinary experience, we think we know lots of things. We think we know whether we're waking or dreaming. We think we know that there are causal connections. We think we know what our personal identity is, and so forth. And the structure of Cartesian problematic is to start by choosing a best case, then constructing an argument from indistinguishability, showing there's vulnerability to doubt, and then showing it generalizes. And if it generalizes, then we don't know what we think we know. So there's been a discovery that comes with the generality. The form of this, as I said in my first lecture, is always, if we don't know this, then we don't know anything of this sort. So in the disclosure that this initially particular claim to knowledge is vulnerable to doubt, we don't merely take ourselves to learn that we don't know a particular thing that we might not have known. In Austin's example, I guess I don't know it's a goldfinch. I don't know that's a goldfinch. Rather, we take ourselves always to learn something about the character of knowledge as such. That's what a Cartesian problematic is designed to make you see. Or at least something about the character of a whole class of knowledge claims. I don't know there's a tomato right in front of me now. I don't know this is a tomato. Then I don't know anything based on the testimony of my senses. And Descartes himself is the first person who's absolutely clear about this. As he says, if he doesn't know that he's sitting right there in his dressing gown in front of the fireplace, then the conclusion is not, well, I guess I didn't know that, but rather then I never know things are as my senses tell me. So another way of putting this is, this third feature is what Stanley Cavell calls the precipitousness of skepticism. But I will say the precipitousness of Cartesian skepticism. That's a mark of this variety. Suddenly, we go from example to boom, something much more general. But what makes the general claim compelling is the example and its structure, not, as Austin suggests, an inferential jump that's unmotivated. Now, I said a bit about this fourth feature. Let's say more about it. That in this generalization, we have a discovery. That in seeing the example generalizes, we discover something. And the form of the discovery is also always one of seeing through the surface of our epistemic practices. We call these things art. We say we know what someone's feeling. We say we know things about the external world. But we can no longer speak with the vulgar when we make these discoveries. I think Richard Rorty is a very nice example of an American philosopher who's completely stuck in the Cartesian problematic. He wants to no longer, skepticism's bad. He doesn't want to have anything to do with skepticism as bad philosophy. But his solution is to completely accept all of the features of Cartesian skepticism we've just discussed as indubitable. So Rorty wants to say, yes, well, we say we know, we say certain things are true, but that's to speak with the vulgar. All we mean when we say something's true is that we agree. That is to concede everything important to the Cartesian skeptic. If that is your view, then you actually are a skeptic, according to me. Which is mine in Cartesian skepticism, if you leave those features untouched. What makes you someone who, in this sense, is a skeptic is not whether you think you're a skeptic. What makes you a Cartesian skeptic for me is if you accept the first feature and the second feature and the third feature and the fourth feature. And then you want to solve it by, say, relabeling and saying, we need a new theory of truth. We need a new theory of knowledge that concedes all of this. So the discovery that is involved in this fourth feature is one in which what we can really know about some area stands in sharp conflict with our ordinary ways of talking and living. Our practices of entering knowledge claims, when I say, well, I know what Matteo's feeling right now, is fundamentally at odds with what we philosophically realize we are entitled to. So even if you give a philosophical story which allows you to speak with the vulgar, Rorty says, yes, for purposes of speaking with the vulgar, I can use true in this way. But our philosophical analysis of why we are speaking with the vulgar accepts these first four features. Then it's Cartesian. Okay, fifth feature. In the fifth feature of each problematic, I give what I call the mood of the skepticism. Borrowing something from Heidegger here, the Stimmung of each variety, if you will. The Stimmung of the Cartesian problematic is always one of disappointment. There's an underlying disappointment. Even if you have someone like Rorty, who's trying to get high, taking us to a new place, underneath that excitement, there's a deep disappointment. And we need to be clear about structurally what the conditions of the possibility of the mood of disappointment are. You're only disappointed about something if you could see what it is to have it. To have it is conceptually possible, but you can't have it. Then you're disappointed. There's an X, there's something that's having an X, but I can't have X. That's the structure of disappointment. And what's characteristic about Cartesian skepticism, as opposed to the other varieties, is that all of that is in place. So, in a Cartesian problematic, one always takes oneself to have an understanding of what it would be for the best case of knowledge to be genuine knowledge, to be possible. That's why I said yesterday, this outside vantage point, in Descartes, the person who occupies the outside vantage point is God. But someone like Rorty, even though he doesn't believe in God, his whole discussion only makes sense given the idea of what Rorty himself calls a God's eye point of view. Rorty will keep saying over and over again, there's no such thing as a God's eye point of view. Therefore. The therefore depends about what we must say. All of Rorty's philosophy is after this therefore. But the therefore is drawing the conclusion of there being no God's eye point of view. So we can make sense of the idea of the God's eye point of view. But we realize that it does not exist. So, we conclude something. So this again is a mark of the structural disappointment of the position. We have to have an understanding of what would have been the case for there to be knowledge here, but we can't have it. The idea of such knowledge must make sense, but be unattainable for it to be a Cartesian problem, and hence for the mood to be disappointed. What we find is that for beings like us, such knowledge is not possible. So our finitude is always construed as a limitation. What Kant calls our Ähnlichkeit is understood as a kind of Beschränkung. And that is the mark of the Cartesian problematic. And what Kant wants to do is give us a non-Cartesian conception of finitude, in which cognitive finitude is not Cartesian limitation. And most people misread Kant because they don't understand this about Kant. They're so stuck in the Cartesian problematic that they have a Cartesian reading of Kant. But it's to miss everything in Kant, not to see that this is what he wants to criticize. He wants a notion of a Grenze of knowledge and thought that is not a Beschränkung. So no disappointment is required. If we have Cartesian Beschränkung, limitation, then we are left with the feeling that something ought to have been possible which, as it happens, as a matter of contingent facts, is not possible for us. And I think the first classic literary exposition of such a mood is in Shakespeare. All of Shakespeare's tragedies are dramas of disappointment. Every one of Shakespeare's heroes has a trust betrayed, a form of knowledge. And perhaps the most famous case in King Lear, it's knowledge that somebody can love you. Also in Othello, it's knowledge. Sometimes it's trust of the world. Sometimes trust in the possibility of honor or some other virtue. but one understands what it would be for such trust to be satisfied and is disappointed. And so one thinks one can no longer trust anymore. Nothing that Desdemona can do can count as a sign for Othello that he can trust her, that he can know, and so on. This is always, so I think we get, in the early modern period, with the Cartesian problematic, a drama of Cartesian disappointment, the betrayal of the conditions of cognitive trust, if you will. And I'm suggesting that such a mood of disappointment or disillusionment is the apparently inescapable, obligatory response to a philosophical inquiry that's stuck in the Cartesian problematic. If you stay in the Cartesian problematic, if you go through feature 1, 2, 3, 4, you don't know how to back up. You don't see where to go forwards. Then your mood, if you're clear, is really one of disillusionment, of disappointment. The sixth feature. I put it in your handout by saying this. 6. The disappointment is born of the impossibility of showing how what we had taken to be possible could be actual. So the disappointment lies in our being actually able to do something that we'd always taken to be, lies in our not actually being able to do something that we'd always taken to be possible. For instance, we're unable to know things are as they appear. So we can formulate thoughts about what the world is like. We can have experience about the world like. We know it would be to know such a thing, but we can't know it. We're sealed inside our minds, if it's the perception case. I am sealed from his thoughts by his body. Screen. So we know what we want to know. We have an idea of what it would be to know that, but we can't do it. I emphasize each of these features because we're about to see them displaced in the Kantian case. The displacement of the sixth one, the impossibility of showing how something we take to be possible could be actual, I think is maybe the most interesting displacement. Seventh feature. This is connected with what I call Cartesian limitation. In Cartesian skepticism, the form of the problem is always, there is something we cannot do. I think a very useful way of contrasting the Cartesian problematic from a philosopher like Kant or a philosopher like Wittgenstein is that they want to change this feature of the problematic. Wittgenstein says in section 373 of the Investigations, what I want to show you is that you must not represent the problem as if it were a case of something we cannot do. But in Cartesian skepticism, that is how the problem is always represented. It seems we must represent it that way. What we cannot do depends upon the Cartesian problematic. But in every case, the variant, I cannot know what he is thinking. I cannot know whether things are as they seem. I cannot know if that's a work of art or a dropped egg. I can tell a story in which I get to sort of entitle myself, but there's no real knowledge any longer possible. So each case, we have a cognitive ability, the ability to know, and we discover a limit on that ability that comes much sooner than we expect. It looks like there's no way to exercise the capacity of knowledge. So it gets what we thought its point was. Sensory perception, that capacity, does not give us sensory knowledge of the world, and so on, for each variant. So this running up against a limit or a barrier that makes it seem like we cannot pass this limit in our cognitive capacity is always the mark of Cartesian skepticism. And I think in many ways, this is the easiest mark to pick up if you're reading a philosopher. If he has this feature of the problematic, that's, in a way, the quickest sign that it's a Cartesian problematic. The eighth feature is the one I discussed most already yesterday, which is what I called the Cartesian gap. This limit is always the consequence. This inability, this not being able to do something, is always the consequence of a Cartesian gap. Usually the Cartesian gap is of the following sort. We have things that are elements of mindedness and elements of worldhood, and we cannot get from one to the other in some way. In the perception case, I have an experience. It's made up of elements of my mind. But what I want to know is something about the world outside my mind. And I cannot bridge that gap. The cannot there has to do with that gap. In the case of other minds, what I have is his body, his performance, his sounds. What I want to know is his feelings. So, in a way, it's the same gap, but traversed from the other direction. In the philosophy of language case, in the classic version I discussed yesterday, we have the signpost. Considered, Wittgenstein says, as it is in itself. As a mere signpost, it's dead. It's a physical object. It could have happened by accident. An ant could draw an arrow on the beach. As a meaningful sign, I have to add something. The thing I have to add must come from me. So how do I bridge the gap between the mere dead sign and the meaning? And so on, in each case. So, in every case of a Cartesian problematic, there's a gap that looms in philosophy of perception between my inner life and the outer world, in other minds between his outer behavior and his inner life, and so on. And the Cartesian takes himself to be making a genuine discovery in discovering this gap. And Cartesian philosophy always involves strategies that either find a way to bridge the gap or to make us feel okay about living on our side of the gap. Doesn't matter which. It's still Cartesian philosophy for me. Sometimes they want to make a bridge. Sometimes they want to say, this side is enough. What we call that side is really elements of this side. So you can have a reductionist strategy. You can have eliminationist strategy. You can have, with the help of God or somebody else, what you might call a bootstrap strategy. But these are all forms of Cartesian philosophy. If we're trying to negotiate such a gap. But the Cartesian who wants to avoid being a skeptic must find a way to negotiate the gap. Descartes looks to help from God. Most subsequent Cartesian philosophy thinks God's not going to be able to help. But in my account, it's no less Cartesian in its structure. So another way of putting what makes you a Cartesian is you take the Cartesian gap to just be there. There's many things you can do still in philosophy, but the gap is there. That you do not doubt. So as long as one operates within the confines of the Cartesian problematic, the only possible forms of what we might call solution to the problem of skepticism involves living with the gap or bridging the gap. But you must accept the gap. And this is what I call the Cartesian gap. Ninth feature, last feature, the Cartesian case. This is what I'll call the practical instability of the Cartesian problematic. It might help here if we have three varieties of skepticism. Think first of Pyrrhonian skepticism. In Pyrrhonian skepticism, the whole point of your skeptical doubt is to live it. To have a doubt, to doubt is something practical. And the skeptic is someone who, in virtue of what he believes in philosophy, and in particular what he doesn't believe, where he suspends his belief, changes the kind of person he is. And the sign of success of the ancient skeptical philosopher is his ataraxia, his spiritual state. So we already have the first displacement or radicalization. So we go from Pyrrhonian skepticism to Cartesian skepticism. Descartes is very clear that the Cartesian doubt is a theoretical doubt. When you are driving your car back to Rome or Pisa, do not think about Cartesian skepticism. You do not want to ask yourself, are there really cars or am I just dreaming? You'll be in an accident immediately. If you're even just going down the stairs or riding a bicycle, it's no time for Cartesian skepticism. Cartesian skepticism, as Hume says, must be performed in the study. It's a theoretical doubt. It's a heuristic doubt. It cannot be converted into practice. Hume says, as soon as we leave the study, our skeptical doubts vanish. It's part of our animal nature. We cannot sustain them. But that doesn't mean it's not important. It allows us to reflect on the real structure of knowledge. But such a reflection is only sustainable theoretically. It is practically unstable. So, the Cartesian inquirer always, at some point, is at least implicitly committed to a distinction between theoretical doubt and practical doubt. And under the pressure of Cartesian philosophy, practical knowledge and theoretical knowledge come to seem like utterly distinct forms of knowledge. This is one of the marks of early modern philosophy, as opposed to ancient philosophy, is the practical and the theoretical become alienated as branches of knowledge. And one of the tasks of German idealism and post-Kantian philosophy is to try to heal that estrangement of these two forms of cognitive exercise. So the Cartesian is implicitly committed to the idea that his doubt here, the kind of intellectual exercise of the cognitive capacity we are involved in fundamental philosophy, is merely theoretical. And this is connected with the idea that such a doubt possesses, as I put it, inherent instability due to the practical impossibility of realizing it in embodied existence. Okay, now, quickly, don't have much time. We go to the second 9 features, the Kantian features. And what I want you to see is that the 9 Kantian skepticism as a whole can be differentiated from Cartesian skepticism by noticing that on the one hand it doesn't have any of these 9 features, but also noticing, to put it more precisely, that it does not quite have any of them. We have a displacement of each. And so what I'm calling the genre of Kantian skepticism exhibits instead the 9 features you have on page 5 of the handout, each of which involves this peculiar kind of displacement or reversal or inversion of the corresponding Cartesian feature. So the first one, in a way, it might not seem like a feature, but it's so important in its difference from Cartesian skepticism that it's worth noting. The first thing I have here is that it's constitutive of the Kantian investigation, that it can now allow itself an indifference to the character of the sort of object it takes up. The tomato and the Japanese beetle. The object under ideal conditions and under difficult conditions. The cognitive attitude of knowledge or of doubt. All these things at once are problematized. The problem is no longer, as in Cartesian skepticism, the exercise of a particular cognitive faculty, knowledge, and a particular kind of exercise of it, namely the successful one that gives us justified true belief. Rather, we're interested in any exercise of that capacity, even a failed one. False belief that is not knowledge is also a problem for the Kantian. How is that possible? And any cognitive capacity in the area, not just knowledge, but doubt, as we saw yesterday, the capacity to dream as well as to know, drops into what he calls a mere blind play if we have a problem of a Kantian form. So, we might put it this way. In the Kantian problematic about what it is to be cognitively related to an object, we must abstract, and this is something Kant says when he's introducing transcendental logic in the Critique. We must abstract from all differences between objects, and initially from the different forms of cognitive relation to an object. Our question, as Kant puts it, is how is the pure thought of an object at all possible? Überhaupt is possible. So the questions, what is it to dream that I'm in front of a fireplace? And what is to actually see a fireplace? Become simultaneously problematized. There's a kind of homogenization of the example. What is it to know that I'm now in Naples, Italy? And what is it to think of the celestial city of Atlantis? Those are capacities that become equally problematic at the same time. We have a Kantian problematic. So the differences between these examples cease to be relevant. So if someone has a Kantian problematic, they are not going to be tinkering with the example in the way we saw the Cartesian must in order to get a Cartesian problematic. And a certain kind of Cartesian philosopher, when they look at the Kantian philosopher, often thinks, this is very bad philosophy. They're very careless about the examples. Cavell reads a certain kind of person who's concerned with Kantian problematic like McDowell. He thinks, this is too fast, what are the examples? But that's not really a good criticism. Because if you have a Kantian problematic, you've precisely failed to miss that the detail in the example will not help you. If the floor of your building is blowing up, it doesn't matter how you stand. You need a floor in order to stand. Second feature, I say on my handout. This is hard. I've learned this is hard to say in any language but English. But what I say in my handout is that the Kantian problematic does not issue in a doubt like Cartesian skepticism. I said it's a mark of Cartesian skepticism that is concerned with doubt. And so someone might want to say that Kantian skepticism is not skepticism because there's no doubt. Okay, call it something else. But many things that people like Kant and Wittgenstein and Kripke have called skepticism is really not concerned with the doubt, if you understand. What is it concerned with? I say here, I use an English word, a boggle. A short version of, an article version of these lectures has been translated to several languages, including German, Swedish, Japanese. And I have learned there's no way to say this in any of these languages. I've looked in dictionaries, and the word boggle is not in them. So this is a problem. So I don't know if there's a word in Italian. The German translation of my article had, it does not issue in ein Zweifel, sondern Wortlosigkeit, wordlessness. But wordlessness is not a cognitive movement, as doubt is. So a boggle is something where your mind tries to grasp something, but in the exercise of trying to grasp it, it cannot achieve. There's an inability for the mind itself to focus on what it's trying to focus on. So there's a movement of the mind in a direction which cannot be sustained. So we want the idea of a kind of capacity that has an apparent telos, but it cannot actually move in this direction. So, for instance, there's an idiom in English, the mind boggles. So you're told a certain kind of thing, and your mind boggles. You're trying to think it, and you think you're thinking, but you can't get your mind around it. That's the form of Kantian skepticism, always. So there is something fundamentally unclear about Kantian skepticism. Because there is a direction it looks like we are now impelled to go philosophically. But there's also a fundamental structure of the problem that makes it unclear what it would be to actually completely go that way. Doubt is stable. We know what a doubt is. We know what it is we want. We can't have it. The doubt has a determinate content. Once we break down into the level of Kantian skepticism, the form of the problem is a boggle. And this is connected to the fact that under the pressure of the Kantian question, all our capacities, remember the capacity to doubt and to dream among them, come to seem equally problematized. Once he's worked his way to a certain point in the philosophical dialectic, the Kantian comes to an impasse. It suddenly no longer seems to impossible that one should so much as be able to frame thoughts that are, for instance, about the world, or to experience another's bodily movements as expressions of motion, or to trace it in forms of words that are more than mere dead signs, that are replete with meaning. So what we always have here is no longer a doubt, but something that fundamentally has the form of a perplexity. A perplexity is what it is to be experiencing or thinking or meaning things in a way that he cannot help but take himself to be doing, through the very act of asking a skeptical question. If I am a Kantian philosopher of language, like Wittgenstein, then I say, there is no fact of the matter about whether you're adding or quadding. There's no fact of the matter about whether you mean this or that. But that sentence, there's no fact of the matter about whether I mean this or that, then becomes a sentence about which there is no fact of the matter about which I mean, which means the problem I tried to pose is starting to disappear. The resources, the intellectual resources I need to frame my problem are themselves resources that my problem itself places in question. Hence a boggle, not a doubt. To move in the direction in which a Kantian's question leads him is also to apparently deprive his question, along with the rest of the train of thought that leads to it, of its determinate content. Because the capacity which we are exercising in posing our problem is itself brought into question. And yet, we are unable to dismiss the question. The question has come to seem intellectually compulsory. So, I say, the mind boggles. It must go and it cannot go in a certain direction. It's such a boggling of the mind in the face of a looming conclusion that can be neither approached nor avoided, neither fully comprehended nor simply dismissed on the grounds of its incomprehensibility. Those are the marks of entanglement in Kantian problematic. There must be something which is consciousness or thinking. But we are mere physical beings, blah, 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 blah. So such beings cannot think. They must be able to, but our understanding of them precludes it. There must be such a thing as free will. But a proper understanding of our nature is one in which each thought we have is caused by something that happens in us, and therefore no thought can be without a cause, and if each thing is has a physical cause, and it only has one cause, then it cannot have a mental cause, so it cannot be a thought that I have caused, so I cannot be free. This is always the structure of a Kantian problem. There's many versions of it. But in framing the first problem, I am exercising the capacity I have doubted. In choosing to be exercised by the second problem, I am exercising the capacity of choice, whose existence I have called into question. There's many forms of this in philosophy, but this is always the structure of the Kantian problematic. So what's third feature? I say, the paradox, and notice this is no reversal of the Cartesian case. The paradox is not the result of moving from a conclusion about a particular object to a general conclusion about all objects of that sort, if perception, all objects of experience. Rather, it's the result of an inability that has come about now to see how there could so much as be such a cognitive relation to a particular. If it's philosophy of perception, how there could be experience of a particular, even in a dream. So what's at issue in the Kantian problematic, we might put it this way, is the possibility of mindedness as such, in all its forms. Aesthetic, agentive, intellectual, social. And if we're talking about claims, then what we're concerned about is the possibility of making claims, überhaupt. Not just knowledge claims. And that means the point of departure for the Kantian investigation is never a particular case of knowledge, but, as I put it yesterday, the vulnerability of our thought or our action or our mindedness to reality as such. And so that in a certain way reverses the direction of the Cartesian investigation. The Kantian paradox is not one that comes about from moving, as in the Cartesian case we saw, from a particular case, a best case, to a conclusion about all such cases. Rather, it's the result of an inability to see how there could be the thing we started from. How there could even be, in the perception case, something which is dreaming in front of the fireplace. So, to respond the Kantian skeptic is to show how our thinking can have a sort of dependence on the world that allows for our activity of making claims, of having vulnerable thoughts, come into view as possible in the first place. How it could even be that our claims could be false, that our dreams could involve a certain relation to a reality, one that obtains that doesn't. And if we have a Kantian problematic, but no solution to the Kantian problematic, then what happens is, if you will, the world appears to recede from our grasp. Not in the sense that we cannot know it, as in the Cartesian case, but it seems like we cannot be cognitively related to it. Not only do we have reason to fear with the Cartesian that we're unable to know which of our claims are true, but rather it's receded to the point where we can no longer make sense of the idea that we're able to enter claims about anything sufficiently determinate in its character to be, as I put it yesterday, a candidate for truth or falsity. So ultimately, the problem in Kantian skepticism is always not the conditions of knowledge, not sorting the true from the false, as in the Cartesian problematic, but they are the conditions of intelligibility, of making sense. And the Kantian problematic is always one in which there's a threat of a dissolution of sense, of meaning, of intelligibility. So this takes us to the fourth feature. The climax in Cartesian skepticism, we said, was a discovery. Aha! Things are not as they seem. In Kantian skepticism, we don't have that possibility of stability. The climax, and the thing the Cartesian philosopher, the Kantian philosopher, is working with, always has the form, as I put it yesterday, of a mystery. That's the form of the problem. Hence I said the response is one of perplexity. So in the three variants of Kantian skepticism I discussed yesterday, I, in each case, characterized the Kantian paradox in question as one in which the possibility of a certain sort of appearance, usually taken for granted, suddenly comes to seem mysterious. In perception, it lies in its coming to seem a mystery. How what impinges on my senses could so much as appear to be of a world. In other minds, it lies in its coming to seem a mystery how a mere inert, fleshy object, a mere expanse of biomatter, could be a picture of a human soul. In the case of philosophy of language, it comes to seem a mystery how mere marks or noises could have a meaning, could be alive with significance. So, always in Kantian, the problematic, there's a sense of our ordinary cognitive capacities appearing not limited, as in the Cartesian case, in a way that's difficult to understand, but as now having become intolerably mysterious. So here too, it's a problem which always involves a contrast between the character of the mental and the physical. But it's no longer a problem of bridging a gap from the mental to the physical. It's rather, given our understanding of the nature of the world, there is no room for mindedness. Even unsuccessful exercises of mindedness, like dreaming. And thinking and speaking. And yet, in order to frame this problem, we need to exercise these capacities that have become mysterious to us. And therefore, it's always the mark of Kantian philosophers. Philosophers are in the Kantian problematic that they understand their problem as one of relieving our discomfort by providing an account of our capacities that drains them of mystery. So if you look, for instance, a good example of this in recent American philosophy is Robert Brandler. He's in this sense a Kantian philosopher. He thinks that we have practices that involve intentionality and meaning. This is mysterious. We must make it unmysterious. One way to make it unmysterious would be reduce it to physical facts. Physicalism is one Kantian response to get rid of the mystery. He thinks that's impossible. But maybe we could reduce it to social facts about deontic practices. We can show that meaning and intending is a matter of a certain kind of social practice. it's the object of the social sciences rather than the physical sciences, then that will make it mysterious. But the very form of this, there is something that is mysterious in this way, which must be made unmysterious, so we are no longer uncomfortable with these capacities. That is the mark of Kantian philosophy in this general sense for me. That is a symptom of entanglement in the Kantian problematic. Now we come to the Kantian Stimmung. I want to say it is not one of disappointment, as in the Cartesian case, but one of despair. Despair is different than disappointment. You despair when you no longer can even make sense of that which you originally thought you wanted. So in the early Christian tradition, one speaks of despair, one finds there can be no God. One cannot have faith in him. So, in a Kantian investigation, as I said, into the very possibility of our being able to frame thoughts, enjoy experiences, the kind of skeptical paradox it results in is one in which, not disappointment, which, like discovery, is only possible where we at least have some glimpse of what it is we want but cannot have, but rather it's a case in which, as Kant says, I quote, this is Kant's definition of skepticism, it's a way of thinking in which reason moves against itself with such violence that it could never have risen except in, Kant says, in völliger Verzweiflung, in complete desperation of achieving satisfaction with respect to reason's most fundamental aspirations. So skepticism is when reason in its exercise comes to question the possibility of itself, and therefore the capacity we are exercising in our investigation in the first place. That's the fundamental form of skepticism. Hence, I think Kant does not call Cartesian skepticism skepticism. He calls it problematic idealism. Such idealisms have not yet reached the clarity of the skeptical problematic that first comes for Kant with Hume. Hume only with respect to some topics. Full skepticism is to realize that the variants all have the same structure, as I put it. So the violence with which here, in what Kant calls skepticism, our cognitive capacities turn against themselves is, in this sense, a violence of the most extreme sort. What is questioned are those capacities themselves, not just one kind of exercise of them. Knowledge, successful knowledge, truth. So our faculty for rational thought arrives at the point where it asks itself, not just whether this or that kind of exercise of this or that capacity is possible, but how it itself is possible. Therefore, Kant's investigation is always directed at the Vermögen of Sinnlichkeit, Verstand, Vernunft as such. The general capacity itself in all of its different forms of exercise. We might contrast what I said about Shakespeare's heroes with saying I think the first full literary expression of Kantian skepticism, I think, is arguably the heroes of Kafka's parables. That is, in Kafka's parables, the mood is one of, in this sense, Kantian despair. It's one of bewilderment at dissolution of the world's conditions of intelligibility. So take some famous Kafka narrative, like The Trial. Originally, what Kay wants to know is whether he's guilty or innocent. He wants to prove his innocence. But what happens as we move through the trial is not that he knows what it is to be innocent, but it becomes more and more difficult to prove that he is. What becomes unclear is what it would be to be innocent. The question which he must ask and to which he must prove his case itself is a question whose determinacy gradually is eroded. This is always the form of the problem in Kafka. Sixth feature. I say the despair is born not of impossibility, of showing how what we take to be possible could be actual, but of showing how what we take to be actual could be possible. Dan Dennett has a sort of joke in which he says, physicists are concerned with the following question. I know it's possible in theory, but is it possible in practice? And then he says philosophers are concerned rather with this problem. I know it's possible in practice, but is it possible in theory? He meant that as a joke, as a kind of criticism of philosophers. You know, they're not concerned with real problems the way scientists are. But actually what I think is that the first formulation is the form of the Cartesian problem. The second is the form of the Kantian problem. So, when reason thus questions, as Kant puts it, its own possibility, Kant will also say the natural history of reason enters a new and radical stage in which we get a skeptical paradox of a different order from the Cartesian. The problem is no longer how to understand something we took to be possible, how that can be actual. Rather, the problem is now one that threatens the entire array of capacities that Cartesian problem took for granted, took to be unproblematically available, like the having of thoughts, the enjoying of experiences, the capacities to doubt and dream, to feel, think, and believe, to enjoy sensory impressions of fireplaces, to frame hypotheses about evil demons. The problem now is to understand how, in any case where we take something to be actual, our experience of dreaming, say, that the exercise of the cognitive capacities evidently actualized, not just in that experience, but in our reflections on it, can so much as be possible. That's the form here always. Seventh feature. It now no longer looks as if there's something we cannot do. Rather looks as if there is nothing to do, where we had previously thought there was something. That's what I mean by the dissolution of the conditions of intelligibility. So what we have in Kantian case is always a collapse of the space of possibilities of a sort. Not that as for the Cartesian, we feel there's something we cannot do, but rather as if there now is nothing to do. There is no place to go to prove your innocence in Kafka by the end. Where we previously thought there must be something. So the Kantian skeptical possibility, rather than disclosing a boundary which our cognitive capacities run up against, seem to deprive us of the territory we're supposed to draw the boundary through. If we want inside or outside, near or far, then we lose both sides in the Kantian problem. The sense in our philosophical inquiry, we've found a way to make the Cartesian limit disintegrate is a symptomatic sign of entanglement in the Kantian problematic. And for philosophers like Kant himself, or as we discussed yesterday, McDowell, it's also a sign of progress. First we radicalize the problem, make the Cartesian limit disappear, and then solve the problem in a more radical form. Eighth feature. This apparent disintegration of the something into a nothing is the consequence of a Kantian gap. So the Kantian gap is always these marks and features, signs, mere bodily behavior, and something else we wanted that it looks like we can't get. Expression, meaning. How do we get the one kind of thing out of the other thing? How can they be related in some internal way? The Kantian gap is one in which it seems like that can't be possible. So the one set of features disappear. There's nothing for them to be. Ninth feature. Remember, we had the Pyrrhonian. We have a theoretical doubt. The whole point is to make it practical. That is the aim of skepticism. We have the Cartesian doubt, which is theoretically totally determinate and stable and gives us an important insight into the human cognitive condition, but it's practically unstable. In the Kantian case, we have a worry that is qua skeptical surmise, already theoretically unstable. The point of instability moves to a more and more fundamental point. So the philosophical outcome that now looms in the Kantian problematic, as I said, threatens the entire array of capacities that the Cartesian wants to take to be unproblematically available. And so the full import of his paradox remains, in this sense, if you will, intellectually unschematizable. There can be no such thing as getting it fully into focus. For getting things into focus is just a further instance of the sort of thing that now seems to be something we can't make sense of how we do. So the Kantian worry is not merely, like the Cartesian one, a form of perplexity that ceases to be sustainable when we translate into practice. It cannot even be sustained fully at the level of theory. If in the Kripke case, the determinate content of my sentence in which I pose the problem about meaning skepticism has no determinate content, then as Kripke says, I am left with an eerie feeling. So, the practical possibility of abstaining, as Descartes or Hume recommends we do, from the modes of thought and expression that philosophy brings into question, is not an option that can present one as momentarily alive. We must be able to think in order to be able to ask the questions, including the question, should we abstain from it? So there's no point to back up and say, should we or not exercise this capacity in this way? We are already doing it. At the same time, we are problematizing it. So the form of skeptical paradox in the Kantian case, if we're clear about it, and most Kantian philosophers, I think, are somewhere between the first 7 features, maybe the 8th feature. Many of them do not realize that they are committed to the 9th feature. It was only very late in his thinking about this that Kripke, I think, became clear about this. They do not realize that the Kantian paradoxical surmise already occupies a state of radical instability qua surmise. The Kantian is someone who finds himself drawn to a question he's both unable to hold stable in his mind and yet unable to dismiss. So what I've done is I've given you the 9 features, the Cartesian variety, Kantian variety, and I'm suggesting that if you open a philosophical text and you look for these features, you can sort philosophers with respect to these varieties, just operationally, by trying to find these features and see how many of them are present. Tomorrow, what I'll do then is apply this schema. And I'll try to show you cases in which philosophers think they agree, but they don't. They think they disagree, but they don't. And we see how to make progress with certain philosophical problems by using the taxonomy. So that's my goal for tomorrow. Thank you for your patience. I'm happy to take questions.
Can I try to?
Sure.
It's not easy. I like very much your talk. And I have some problem with the Kantian side.
You should have problems.
I didn't read the end of your paper. And okay, I think that my question is linked to Carel. But work of Carel, I didn't read, I'm just starting to read the Claim of Reason, and I'm thinking of a small article, small introduction to a last book of anthropologist. Her name is Mina Das, and there is a little introduction
I've read that.
of Carel.
Yes.
And the answer is I think is linked as well. I can make the link, so I say linked all
Yes.
the time.
Yes. Yes.
What you said about your own way, trying to find the structure of the problematic.
Yes.
And it's linked as well on what you were saying at the beginning on Socrates.
So good.
And it's linked as well with something in philosophical investigation. So my problem is with your Kantian skeptic. I don't like it. I think ground is Cavell.
Yes.
This text of Cavell.
Yes.
There is a claim in this text. He said, it's very, very strong. He said that, like anything, he's talking about philosophy, and he said, its originating form of life is the singular human being dissatisfied with itself. Where you speak of Boglet, second feature,
Yes.
in this text, he speaks of uncanny.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Actually, I've read, I don't know where, in French translation of the
Yes.
text of Cadell, that for him, the autobiography, it was his own answer to phenomenology. Autobiography. So there is a link, and I'm thinking,
Yes.
because I don't know very well Cadell,
Yes.
between the conceptual work and the autobiography. Okay. Can I make an answer from all these things? Something like you speak as well of violence.
I was quoting Kant.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right.
I was
The
quoting
violence
Kant's definition of
of
skepticism.
this kind of skepticism.
Yes. Kant's word is Gewalt.
Mhm.
But maybe I can say some things.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So,
Thank you.
so the first thing I want to emphasize is my initial distinction here between these two genres of skepticism, Cartesian and Kantian, with these noun features. This is a descriptive apparatus. There's, in a sense, nothing to agree with or disagree with. I'm not, in a sense, making a philosophical claim. Believe this view or that view about something. I'm saying, here are tools for description. If you try to use them, I claim, you will find they apply. So first, if you look at Descartes and the first meditation, you will see all 9 of these features. If you read Kant's analytic carefully, most of it, before the refutation of reason, you will see it has the second set of features, not the first. If you take Kant to just be doing the same thing as Descartes, trying to answer the skeptic, and you use the word skeptic as if there was no slippage, you will misread somebody, because these features are quite different in their surface structure. And my claim is similarly for many other philosophers. If you look at the problems of A.J. Ayer or Bertrand Russell in the Owen tradition, if you look at the problems of the early Sartre in the Continental tradition, you will find they have the Cartesian form. What can I doubt? What can't I doubt? The consciousness is what I cannot doubt. What I can doubt, and so forth. And it will have those features. If you read Heidegger carefully, if you read the later Merleau-Ponty carefully, if you read Wilfrid Sellars carefully, if you read John McDowell so carefully, people on both sides of the ocean, you will find they have the Kantian features. So one of the things I want to bring out is that this is a descriptive tool. And the most straightforward thing I want to show, I want to say that this has many implications. But the most straightforward one is that just because someone is dealing with something called skepticism, you don't yet know what the form of the problem is. That's a claim. But you have to look. It has these, many of my first set of features, it has one form. It has many of my second set of features, the form of the problem is different. This is an important thing to see. But it's a descriptive claim. So the only way you can argue with me is to say something like, I don't think anybody's problem has the form of the Kantian features. But I think you would just be wrong about that. You would be descriptively wrong. So that's the first thing. What I want to argue tomorrow, is something much more subtle, which is that most of the terminology that philosophers introduce, now we need to something like a notion of philosophical terminology. So say we're talking about philosophy of perception. Here's some examples of philosophical terminology. The given, consciousness, the object as such, epistemic. I could go on. Make a very long list of words like this. Data, presentation, awareness, and so on. All of these words, if they're inflected in a Cartesian register, have one logic. If they're reflected in a Kantian register, they take on a different logic. So you have philosophers who are uttering the same sentences, but their problem has a very different shape. And this leads to fundamental misunderstanding. So, an example we will discuss next time, but I just mentioned it so you have a chance to look at it at home if you like, is to look at quotations 1 and 2 under Roman 5, pages 5 and 6. The first quotation is from an English philosopher named H.H. Price. The second one is from an American philosopher called C.I. Lewis. They're both from the first chapter of a book called The Given. The chapter has the same title. And they have all of the same words in it. Presentation, data, consciousness, object, epistemic, and so forth. So if you read these two quotations quickly, one of them is an example of a tomato, the other is an example of a fountain pen. If you look at these two quotations quickly, you'll think they're about the same thing. They're two philosophers explaining the same thing. It's just if you read them carefully, you use my apparatus, you will see that Price's problematic has the Cartesian features. Lewis's problematic has the Kantian features. You completely misunderstand one of these philosophers. Usually it's Lewis who's misunderstood, by reading him through the spectacle of the other. One of them is a very deep reader of Kant. The other, namely Lewis, and this is a sign of a deep reader of Kant, that these features stand out clearly, I think. Price is a deep reader of Descartes who thinks that Kant's just another Cartesian. This becomes then very tricky. You can't just tell from the words. Another example I will give you next time is whole sentences. Hilary Putnam repeats whole sentences from McDowell, and he quotes them. And he says, I agree with McDowell about this. But he completely changes the meaning of the sentence by reinscribing it a Cartesian problematic. So now, Cavell. What I want to say about Cavell, now I'm answering you, but that was to prepare the way, is that I think Cavell, this is my own view, is the best topographer we have so far of the logic of the Cartesian problematic. So, my 9 features of Cartesian skepticism, many of them you will see at some point Cavell mentioning. It's not an accident that Cavell actually writes about the Shakespearean dramas and the disappointment. He writes about, my third feature he calls precipitousness. The first feature, actually, the name of it, Best Case of Knowledge, I take from him. I think it's the perfect description, that first feature. So he doesn't necessarily arrange everything the way I do. But he is a master of mapping, of giving us, if you will, cartography of Cartesian skepticism. But precisely because that is the foreground example for him, he thinks of skepticism for him just means what Cartesian skepticism means for me. So something else we'll look at next time, and it's very relevant to your question, but again, it's something you might want to study briefly in the bathroom or elsewhere before tomorrow, is quotation 8 on the handout, page 7. This is Cavell about Kripke. Cavell's reading Kripke. This is from the second chapter of Conditioned Handsome and Unhandsome, which is translated to French. He there says, I look at these things that Kripke speaks of. This eerie feeling, meaning vanishing into the world, and so forth. And he mentions a number of the things that Kripke mentions. And I ask myself, are any of these things belong to what for me have been touchstones of skeptical paradox? And he concludes no. And what he basically does is he looks at some of the things that Kripke mentions as crucial features of what Kripke calls meaning skepticism, reading Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox. And he looks at his own cartography of Cartesian skepticism, including some of the features I discussed. And he says, does the rule-following problematic start with a best case of knowledge? No, it doesn't. Does it issue in a doubt? No, it doesn't. Kripke's very clear about this. Does it generalize from the particular to the general? We go from a particular case to this precipitous conclusion? No, it doesn't. So he goes through his features. And I think every step of his argument is correct. Every feature he mentions, and he asks, does Kripke's problematic have it? He concludes, no, he's right. He concludes, therefore, it's not a skeptical paradox. And what I want to say about Cavell is every step of his argument is correct, except the conclusion. From my point of view, the conclusion is a non sequitur. The conclusion I draw is, therefore, it is not a Cartesian skeptical paradox. But the very features of Kripke that he does pick out, he's quite a good reader of Kripke in a sense, and he mentions, are on my list of Kantian features. So we have Cavell in a sense, because he's a good reader, actually noticing some of my Kantian features. That's very surprising. Is there anybody else there?
No post-it.
Arrivederci. You could easily develop a skeptical question about whether there are more people back there. I'll try not to think about it. So Cavell notices things I call Kantian features. He has a very clear sense of what the Cartesian features are. But he identified skepticism with Cartesian skepticism. So his reaction is to just think, Kripke has a very weird problem. I don't know why he's concerned about it. But it's not skepticism. And then he also excludes, and therefore it's not a problem Wittgenstein is interested in. And here I think Cavell is quite wrong. I think he's a wonderful, as I put it, cartographer of Cartesian skepticism. And this is a tremendous achievement. And he is a very sensitive reader of Wittgenstein in this respect, because he's appreciating Wittgenstein's own, as it were, cartography of the Cartesian problematic. But he's missing many things that matter, I think, in missing what he does about Kripke's problematic. I think Kripke is reading the problem, the form of the problem that Wittgenstein is concerned with in the rule-following problematic quite well. Kripke's idea of Wittgenstein's solution has nothing to do with Wittgenstein. That's different now. But the form of the problem, I think, is Wittgenstein. And I think it's very much connected to something Wittgenstein will call skepticism. And its form is very much connected to something that Kant calls skepticism. It's not just a weird problem. It's something that in the tradition recurs from Kant on, starting actually with Hume, as a form of problem. And not to be able to see this form of problem and its distinctness from the Cartesian form costs you a great deal, I think, in reading Kant, in reading some parts of Wittgenstein, and so forth. So Cavell's reaction is to say something like, yeah, I don't like this. This is a weird problem. It's Kripke's. It's not what I call Cartesian skepticism. That's certainly right. But what I want to respond to that is just that it is, first of all, I mean, there's further philosophical claims I'll make tomorrow. But today, I'm just going to say it's descriptively inaccurate to say it's just Kripke's. It is in Wittgenstein, and it is in Kant, and it's in many other figures. Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Lewis, Strawson, McDowell, Sellers. There are many important philosophers that you cannot understand if you do not see him as standing in this tradition, if you will, between Kant and Kripke, and having a problem with this form. So there's lots of philosophy that is misread if it is read through, in this sense, Cartesian spectacles. Now, the full story about Cavell, I'll try to say a little bit more about this tomorrow, but the full story is, I think, he does see over and over again that Wittgenstein is operating at what I'm calling the Kantian level. So if you look at what Cavell says about criteria, for instance, like the whole problematic of criteria operates at the Kantian level. I'll say something about that tomorrow. But what Cavell doesn't see is that there's a skeptical problematic that can arise in connection with that level. He only sees what I'm calling the Kantian level as having application and responding to Cartesian skepticism. He doesn't see that Wittgenstein and other philosophers are very interested in a form of problem that comes up at that level. So I'll say more about that tomorrow. But so what I'm saying is, first of all, to you as an answer, I'm not championing Kantian skepticism today. I'm not saying this is good, that bad. I'm giving you a descriptive apparatus. 9 features, and I'm saying, go forth and apply these. And I think you will find sometimes these apply, sometimes those apply.
My problem, not yours.
Yeah, so sometimes there's a mix, and that's interesting. We can talk about that. Second thing I'm saying is, you're quite right to say something like this on Cavell's behalf. I don't like this Kantian skepticism. What I want to call skepticism is the Cartesian side. That's exactly right about Cavell. And it's connected to Cavell's achievement, which I think is his comparative, painstaking clarity in really trying to give us, if you will, a full phenomenology of the Cartesian problematic. And for that, I honor him. But the other side of that is a blindness to a problematic that has a different form, a different stimulus, a different phenomenology. And he misses something important in the philosophical tradition on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean in not being able to see that clearly. So I think it makes him a very bad reader of Kant. It makes him blind to important things in Wittgenstein. It makes him very dismissive of figures like Kripke and McDowell. And I think there's a cost there to the blindness. But this is often true in philosophy, that people's strength comes with a constitutive blindness. It's easy to say that after you have the benefit of the philosopher's strength, to notice his blindness. It's a very easy criticism. It's very easy to talk about the thing that Beethoven can do that Mozart can't, as a mere, listener. And similarly in philosophy. But nonetheless, it's important to register the relationship between the blindness and the power of the vision. I do think there's a blindness there in Cavell that you are correctly noticing. Yes?
Question for you. A question about a priori
Yes.
in Wittgenstein. The kind of a priori that Mary McGinn, she says that she has found an uncertainty in his
Yes.
book,
Yes.
Sense Uncertainty.
Yes.
Because I think your 9 Cartesian features
Mm-hmm.
are very useful to show how reading of Wittgenstein could be involved in a Cartesian way. I think the reading of Wittgenstein that Mary McGinn makes in Sense Uncertainty is a Cartesian reading of Wittgenstein.
Exactly.
And
Exactly right.
my problem is this, probably. I cannot see how could be said that Wittgenstein is involved in a pre-linguistic feature, the frame of our practice,
Yes.
the multi-proposition,
Yes, yes.
and a feature that is a priori, prior to our experience.
Yes.
And my question could be roughly formed as,
Yes.
do you think that maybe Mary McGinn thinks that because she is reading Wittgenstein with Cartesian goggles?
Yeah. Well, I think she is reading Wittgenstein with Cartesian goggles in that book. I should say that she's written a lot about Wittgenstein since she wrote that book, and I think she is making progress. But talking about Mary McGinn in the 1980s when she wrote that book, I think she is stuck with a Cartesian reading of the level at which uncertainty is addressing the skeptic. It has to be put very carefully. I said the level at which it's addressing the skeptic. So Wittgenstein in Uncertainty, like Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, also is concerned to address the Cartesian skeptic. But the way he addresses the Cartesian skeptic, like Kant, is not simply by accepting the form in which the Cartesian presents the problem. So there is some discussion here and there. Actually not very much, but there is some discussion in Uncertainty of Cartesian skepticism, especially towards the end. As there is in the Critique of Pure Reason, some discussion of Cartesian skepticism. He calls it problematic idealism, especially at the end of the Transcendental Analytic. But the level of the inquiry is completely missed if one does not see that there is, as it were, a shifting of the question to the Kantian dimension. And she misses that. I don't think that's her only problem. I think there's a number of things going wrong at once. One is there's a Cartesianizing. But there's various other problems too. But let's just stick to the Cartesianizing. One of the marks of, I could go through all 9 features and show you how it's Cartesian and why it's a misreading in each of these respects by having these features. But let's just pick one, so I don't take too long to answer the question. And then if you want more, you can have more. But let's take feature 7. There's something we cannot do. This is the form of the problem in the beginning. It looks to her like there's something we cannot do. I want to say, I know I have this in here. There's something I want to say. There's a content I want to express. This is it. But I cannot express it. Moore expressed it, but he shouldn't have. We cannot express it. But there is an it we cannot express. And her reading of Moore-type propositions or frame propositions are propositions that have a content, which we give a story about why we cannot express them. That is to miss the level completely, the way in which Wittgenstein wants to shift it to a Kantian level. What Wittgenstein wants to show you is that a sentence we now have to say, like, this is a hint, or I am here, or I am not here. There's a sentence, and that is, as I put it in something I've written, a linguistic instrument that can mean indefinitely many things on different occasions. We don't yet have, and this is always the sign of a shift to the Kantian from a determinacy of content, and just picking up at the level the Cartesian does the sentence. What it means depends upon its contents. And if we just pick out this sentence, and it's not clear what we are doing with it, it's not clear what would count as a response, it's not clear, as Wittgenstein might put it, how it engages the circumstances. This is how to understand Wittgenstein's remarks about language feiert, die Sprache feiert. Language is on a holiday, or it's like an engine idling. The linguistic instrument is not engaging the circumstance. Yeah. If there isn't this internality between use and meaning, then what we have is a noise that is not doing anything. It has no sense. So there's an idea already in the Tractatus that survives, which is the only way something can be nonsense is not because we have used the sign in an impermissible way, because there's something we cannot do. We cannot give the sign in the wrong sense, he says. There is nothing we cannot do. Every possible proposition is something we may say.
This is the deep combination
This is
with
the deep
Frege.
connection. Yeah, exactly. And with Frege, good. And rather, what Wittgenstein wants to say is we have failed to mean something by our words. So the very idea of a Moore-type proposition, which we can pick out independently of circumstances and say, this is what it means, but we cannot say it, is both to miss the level at which Wittgenstein is working and is to create a Cartesian problematic. I've shown you how it's the 7th feature, but the other Cartesian features come with this feature. So I think it is completely missing the level at which Wittgenstein operates. But one other thing I would say about this, which is now much more complicated, is that another problem, aside from Cartesianizing uncertainty, is that McGinn takes everything in uncertainty to be addressing the same point, the same kind of skeptic. Whereas I think there are many different things going on. So I think the first stretch of passages are concerned to address Moore's article, Proof of the External World. That article, when Moore says, I know this is a hand, the conclusion he's trying to get to is there are external objects. So this is one kind of skepticism. It's directed at our being able to say things like, there are external objects. To put it in, use some language I used in my response to this question. The claim we're trying to vindicate involves philosophical terminology. There are external objects. That's not something your grandmother ever said. You know, you already have to introduce philosophical terminology to say this. And the question is then, what is the meaning of that sentence expressed with this philosophical terminology, which Moore wants to prove? In trying to prove the truth of the sentence with philosophical terminology, Wittgenstein wants to say Moore himself is being sucked into the Cartesian problem. So there's a Kantian address, but he's also trying to show something about how an answer like Moore's there doesn't have the distance from the philosopher he needs to give him a helpful theory. But then, once we go further into uncertainty, the next 50 sections or so come out of Moore's article, A Defense of Common Sense. And I think Wittgenstein wants to say, these are not the same thing. There's more things. So now we have propositions like, I have always been near the surface of the earth. Sentences like this. Sentences, as Wittgenstein puts it, that form part of the path along which inquiry always travels. Part of the riverbed which guides the river. But the riverbed can shift. His discussion of that, of what he calls propositions of common sense, he wants to show it's a completely different form. These are sentences already, in ordinary English that can have a use. Is completely different from his treatment of sentences like there are external objects. McGinn's category of Moore-type propositions includes there are external objects and I've always been the surface of. So it already is lumping things together, which Wittgenstein is treating separately. So the first problem is she has a Cartesian treatment of this category she's inventing. That's a mistake. But there's another mistake underneath that mistake, which is assuming there's this homogeneous category, whereas Wittgenstein wants to say there's a number of different kinds of case which have to be treated differently. So I think there's many things that go wrong in this reading. And so I don't think the only problem is the Cartesianizing, but I think it's a big problem. But even if you fix the Cartesianizing, you still have to change other things too. So that would be a short answer to your question.
In her lecture, it's like she is saying that the bed of the river is a priori
Yes.
in respect of the river.
Yes. But I think Wittgenstein wants to. Wittgenstein wants to say there are external objects as a linguistic instrument in search of an application. The sentence I've always lived close to the surface of the earth, I think he wants to say, forms a presupposition of our inquiry. But there is something we could count as it's turning out to be false, like that happened since he wrote the book. Sputnik, and then, what was it, Apollo, something or other, Apollo 13? They went to the moon, 1969. And so it's not so clear what, to do to make their external objects, change its status. So I think, so I don't think Wittgenstein has her Cartesian conception of the a priori ever, but his criticism of this conception is different at different points, depending upon the example. So part of what I think he would think she's falling into is Moore's mistake of thinking that all of these things he's saying against the skeptic all belong in the same category. So part of his criticism of Moore there, I think, would apply to McGinn. And it's very interesting. Almost most of the sentences she says have no application. I think it's useful to just see. It's a very simple point, but it helps. To see, it's very easy to come up with circumstances in which they could be used. One example she gives is the sentence "I am not here." She wants to say that is a sentence you could never utter. It would always be false if you uttered it. So its content is inexpressible. But in America, I've noticed very often if people have telephone answering machines, I don't know, you know what these are? You call them, you get their machine, and it says, "My name is Jim Conant, I am not here, please leave a message." You know, you don't think, "Oh my God, he's uttered a wartime prophecy. Is it possible?" You understand it perfectly. So I think it's very connected with Wittgenstein's point that this linguistic instrument can be given a sense. But then once you give it a sense, it doesn't say what you wanted it to do. When you had the philosophical boggle that it expresses an inexpressible content. So this is also, I think, very un-Wittgensteinian of her, to pick up these sentences and to say something about their general conditions of assertability, apart from any consideration of circumstances. So I think the book is quite a deep misunderstanding of Wittgenstein. But I think her recent book on the Tractatus, Elucidating the Tractatus, it's a new book, is much better. So philosophers, don't stop reading them again.
No.
Just don't read that book. Yes.
I have a question, but it's quite a strange question. But I don't know if it's focused on what you said or what you're interested in. When you spoke about the practical and instability of the Cartesian one,
Yes.
Cartesian side, and the theoretical instability of the Kantian side, my question is this one. It's hard to explain what I have in mind. So, it's from your text, from your features that you sorted here, it seems that with skepticism, with these two varieties of skepticism, we have a relation of the theoretical and practical that it's very problematic. And my question is this. Could that be a kind of skepticism, probably different from this one, that have a problem with practice but not with the theoretical side? Because in these two kinds of skepticism you explain us, the problem is theoretical in some place. This theoretical skepticism has forms problems for the practical side, on the practical side. Could that be that we have only problem with the practical side that treats the theoretical side
as unproblematic? Yes, I understand your question.
I'm sorry because I've not.
I've understood your question quite well.
So
I think there's some. Let me state your question to see if I understand, and then so there's a suggestion in what I'm saying. You're hearing a suggestion that we can have a kind of problem on the theoretical side, but when we go to practice, we can't take the problem to practice. And you're asking, but couldn't there be a kind of philosopher who thinks there's a skeptical problem on the practical side that has no analog on the theoretical side? So there's an asymmetry here. Couldn't we have this other person? My answer to that question is, it depends. Well, my short version of my answer is yes and no. Or as the Germans like to say, jein. The reason I say yes or no is it depends what you mean by can we have. So I will clarify this in a moment. But before I do that, let me step back and alleviate, I think, an underlying misunderstanding that you might have had. What I really think, this goes beyond what I said in the lectures, but what I really think is that if you look at ancient philosophy, if you look at philosophy up until the early modern period, and I think not accidentally, until the rise of modern post-Cartesian, Galilean, Newtonian science, you do not have these philosophical problems that even ever involve this fundamental asymmetry of the practical and the theoretical. There are some differences between the practical and theoretical. Aristotle emphasized in the Nicomachean Ethics that practical questions have a different level of exactitude, and there's the analogy of the arrow and the target. But there isn't this fundamental asymmetry in the kind of question. Philosophy is always both simultaneously a discipline that at every moment has a theoretical and a practical aspect. I think it's a typical post-early modern misreading of the theoretical writings in ancient philosophy, to take them to be concerned with a merely theoretical question. So it's a misreading of ancient skepticism not to see at every point that the entire inquiry is directed at the question how to live, as well as what to believe and what to suspend belief about, and so on. So I think it's with early modern philosophy, it is with the Cartesian problematic, that the possibility of the estrangement of theoretical from practical reason first comes. So this is a deep claim about a consequence of this Cartesian problematic. Today I'm just describing the Cartesian problematic. It's a further step to understand what the consequences are of the structure I'm just describing today. But I think this is a consequence. And I think with Kant and German idealism and that subsequent tradition, there is, in this structural sense, an attempt to go back to the ancients. That is, they want, as the German idealists will say, Kant or Fichte or Hegel, they're interested in the unity of reason. Practical and theoretical reason have to be understood as aspects of a single capacity. So they want to, at least they want to, at a level of aspiration, to overcome this estrangement. And so I think that itself, at the deepest level, is a very interesting difference between people in the Cartesian tradition and people in the Kantian tradition. And so in this respect, Cavell's sense of this deep asymmetry between the problem of the external world and the problem of the mind is itself a sign of someone who's more comfortable in the Cartesian tradition, I think. So for me, it's very important that the issue you're raising is within the Cartesian ambit. It's not a general question about all these skeptics. Right. But still, your question comes back. I've indexed your question a little more precisely, but it comes back. And then, are there such philosophers? Well, the answer is, in one way, yes. That is, you can find philosophers who think they have a problem that is peculiar to practical case, but has no analog in the theoretical case. So, if you look on your handout, I didn't discuss this, but I put it in the handout because I had a suspicion something like this would come up. If you look at problem 4, the problem of intentional action, as I call it here, I give you a Cartesian case of the problem of intentional action, and I give you a Kantian case of the problem of intentional action. And there are lots of people, I think, today who work in the problem of philosophy of action, and they think they have a very particular problem that's special to practical reason. And they will tell you it has no analog in the theoretical case. That's what they will say. John Searle, Jennifer Hornsby, Brian O'Shaughnessy, those are some cases. And they're not great names, but they're good names from the analytic tradition. They're all people who would tell you that. But the point of my larger chart here is to show you they are wrong. So if you mean, can there be such people? And it's a question about their own self-understanding of their problem. Yes, there's lots of them. It goes with the specialization of philosophy. They work in philosophy of action. They think their problems are very special. But in fact, I think it's very important to see that their problems have exactly the same form as problems in other areas of philosophy, including just philosophy of perception. So one very big basic problem in philosophy of action, people will say, what's the difference between my raising my hand and my hand going up? This famous passage from Wittgenstein where he says, if I subtract my hand going up from my raising my hand, what's left? And people think of this as the problem of intentional action. This is special. This is a very special problem. I do practical philosophy. I do philosophy of action. This problem is special to this area of philosophy. Are there people who think that? Yes. Zillions. They write articles. If you go to their website, it gives their name and it says, area of specialization, philosophy of action. And they think this problem is peculiar. But part of what I want you to see is that the actual form of the problem very much rehearses my Cartesian problematic. we have two indistinguishabilia. We have my hand going up, qua physical event, and we have my raising my hand, considered as a physical event. And those two supposedly different events, considered as physical events, seem to be indistinguishable. And now we want to know, what must we add to get the intention, the minded aspect of the agency as a supplement to the worldly aspect of the agency? And that is the structure of a Cartesian gap. Also, I mean, it's not just that their problems have the same form as problems elsewhere, for instance, philosophy of perception, but they have what they think are different problems that are problems of the same form. So that problem, the problem of intentional action I just gave you, what's the difference between my hand going up and my intending to raise my arm? I'm looking at you. How do I tell the difference between the one and the other? Notice that has the structure of the problem of other minds. What's the difference between he's pretending to be in pain and he's in pain, given that his physical performance is the same? But here's another problem, which people think is a different important problem in philosophy of action. What's the difference between my successfully trying to do something and my unsuccessfully trying to do something? So Jennifer Hornsby discusses this. So say I try to raise my hand. I'm going to try to raise my hand. That went really well. But now say my hand is paralyzed. We've injected something that paralyzes it. I now try to raise my hand. Nothing happens. But now we think, the two cases, am I trying to raise my hand or raise my hand? Am I trying to raise my hand and nothing happening? Have something in common. Their highest common factor, their lowest common denominator, is my try in both cases. Because this has the structure of the dreaming problem. On my side, on the side of the mind, whether I'm dreaming I'm in front of the fireplace, whether I'm in front of the fireplace, from the point of view of the structure of res cogitans, things are the same. How things are in the world outside of it are different. Here, on the side of res cogitans, I'm trying, in both cases, what happens there is different. And so in both cases, there is the assumption of, as McDowell puts it, I call indistinguishability. McDowell speaks here of the highest common factor. This is his word for this Cartesian feature that makes the Cartesian gap possible. And those supposedly different problems in the philosophy of action, I think if you have a clear overview of the Cartesian problematic, you can see is actually two forms of the same problem. Once you have a Cartesian understanding of how mind relates to body, or how intention relates to physical behavior, if to have one of these problems is to have the other problem. They're not two different problems. They are the same problem coming back in two different forms, because you have a Cartesian gap. And if you have a Cartesian gap, you can have a highest common factor on either side of the gap, and you don't know how to cross. So it's not just that I want to say that these philosophers who think they have a problem within Cartesian philosophy that is like Descartes' problem about theoretical doubt, but it's asymmetrical, it's practical doubt, are not right about that. But I want to say they don't even see the generality of the problems, even just within philosophy of action. Everything looks like a separate problem that needs to be treated separately. So Jennifer Hornsby thinks that she has a solution to the first problem, but the second problem is much deeper, and people haven't addressed it. And I think that itself is a sign of a lack of an overview of the homology of structure. So the answer to your question is yes, there are such philosophers who think there is asymmetry, and no, I don't think there really is such an asymmetry, although I said the answer was yes, because I think the belief in the asymmetry presupposes a kind of unclarity about the problem. Now, I do think, I don't want you to misunderstand me, so I'll just add one more thing. I do think there are important differences between practical reason and theoretical reason. I do think there's a difference between practical knowledge and theoretical knowledge. It's not that I'm saying there's things. But I think once you drop to these fundamental skeptical paradoxes, what happens is you cannot do the right kind of justice to the real asymmetries, the real differences. At this level of skeptical problem, you have an acid that dissolves both, and so you can't see the differences. So I'm not saying there are no differences, but I'm saying at the level of these skeptical paradoxes. In the ancient case, in the Kantian case, there's a systematic reason why you shouldn't find such a difference. In the Cartesian case, there's an appearance of an asymmetry, but I think it depends on an unclarity.
So if I understood well, if one says that practical problems or practical reason is prior to theoretical reason, it means nothing, because it depends on first the problem you're trying to solve,
Yeah.
and then the variety of skepticism you are in, and the philosophical language you use to inquire that kind of problem.
What I think is, what I think is, if you, I think problem is too vague, right? If you think there is, in my sense, in one of my senses of skeptical, a skeptical problem that is prior to or peculiar to practical reason, but not theoretical reason, I think I can show you you're wrong. But if you just say there's a problem, that's rather vague. I'm not so sure you're wrong. Depends what you mean by problem. Just so I'm not being too evasive here. Look, I think this is a genuine difference between practical and theoretical reason. Take the sentence, I am crossing the street. I think here are two different occasions of use of crossing the street. One is, I'm crossing the room, let's say. Okay, I'm crossing the room. Now, when I said I'm crossing the room there, that sentence used by me in the first person, as I walk across the room, when I say I'm crossing the room, is expressive of practical knowledge. I think it's a complete misunderstanding of how I arrive at such knowledge. If you were to say, Professor Conant is crossing the room, you would observe me, see I'm crossing the room, and say, when I say I am crossing the room, I do not observe myself. Notice I am crossing the room. This is connected with the fact that my eyes can be closed, my ears can be stopped, I can pinch my nose, I can freeze my tongue, and although I will not be able to speak, I can correctly think I'm crossing the room. If I stop your ears, cover your eyes, pinch your nose, freeze your tongue, you are not in a position to know, not just say, but to know Professor Conant is crossing the room. My access to the truth of the sentence, I'm crossing the room, is not observational. Second example. We open these doors. It helps maybe if I'm on this chair. Let's imagine this chair has wheels. It's an office chair. There are wheels. Someone else comes out this door. This woman, again, she comes out. She hits my chair very hard, and my chair slides across the room. I look around and I think, I'm crossing the room. Same sentence. I'm crossing the room. But this sentence is no longer expressive of practical knowledge. That sentence now is describing something I know, Professor Conant is crossing the room, the same way you know, through observation. I no longer, and indeed, if I stop up all my senses, I'm not in a position to know I'm crossing the room. I probably may feel some centrifugal force, in my body. But Einstein would say, I can't tell if it's a gravitational field or it's a part of the voice. It would not be the same knowledge. So there's definitely all kinds of important asymmetries between practical and theoretical knowledge. I'm not denying that. And you can have a problem. So here's a problem. What kind of knowledge is that that's expressed in the first person? That's an interesting philosophical problem. It has no analog. And so it's not that I'm saying there are no differences in problem. What I'm saying is if you get to the level of Cartesian skepticism or Kantian skepticism, you are not in a position to investigate that difference in an interesting way. Because you have a skepticism that corrodes your understanding of the possibility in such a way that the threat you pose to either knowledge is a threat for the other. So it's not. So I'm not saying any problem about the one is a problem about the other. The word problem is a very vague word in philosophy. And I think there are problems, puzzlements we can have about practical agency that have no analog with respect to observational knowledge. But these skeptical problems, the Cartesian problematic in one way, the Kantian problematic in another way, make each form of knowledge or each form of reason, in the Kantian case it might be better to say, simultaneously problematized. The difference is the Cartesian is very likely not to notice this, whereas it's harder for the Kantian to miss that he has a problem that touches both at once. So, sorry that was long, but it's a difficult question. Okay, one more question, sure.
I'd like to go back to the issue of Cartesian features and Cabal
Okay, good.
and skepticism. I'm not really clear about what I'm going to say.
That's all right. It's my job.
So you were saying that your description of Cartesian skepticism borrows a lot from Cabal's description, but I was struck by the fact that there is one particular feature which is important for Cabal and which I don't find in your
Yes, tell me.
Cartesian picture,
Good.
which is his idea of the truth of skepticism, or the
Yes.
truth in skepticism.
Yes.
And I was thinking about, it's just, Cabal's point is that there is something in skepticism, there is something that the skeptic sees and that we don't want to overcome, we don't want to dissolve,
Yes.
some kind of truth.
Yes.
It's just a truth like twisted in the wrong way, you can say. And it's just like, this is particularly clear for Cabal in the case of other mind
Yes.
skepticism. It's just like we have this experience of disappointment about separateness. And I was thinking that this is somehow related to another displacement of your description, because your idea of disappointment, your reference to this idea of mood, in skepticism comes when the investigation ends, while in Cabal it seems to be something that comes into play when the investigation begins. And I was thinking, this is another tool I'm trying just to
Yes.
set it up,
Yes.
that maybe his problem, his refusal of seeing why Kantian skepticism is a kind of skepticism, has to do with this, that for Cabal, a skeptic problem is something like an experience that individual human beings have. And this is like the beginning of the...
Yes.
So, well,
Yeah. Well, you've already given me a lot
yeah.
to have to comment on. There's a very common misreading of Cabal. And the misreading of Cabal is to think that when he talks about the truth in skepticism or the truth of skepticism, he's saying something like, what the skeptic thinks is true, or even part of what the skeptic thinks as the skeptic understands it is true. And that's just a misreading of Cabal. He's using the phrase, in a very particular way. I suppose it's an English idiom when one speaks of the truth and so, the truth of something. And there's a sense in which, at least in Hegel, Hegel will speak of the truth in empiricism. And it's important for Hegel's story that at each stage in the dialectic, each thing with synthesis and antithesis, each thing has a truth in it. That can't mean each thing is true. It would require synthesis. That would be a contradiction. So the truth in does not mean it is true. It means that once we've, as it were, overcome it, from this vantage point, we see that there was a truth in it. But the truth in it, we can only understand once we've overcome it. So what Cabal speaks of as the truth in skepticism is only a point of view on skepticism that we can attain subsequent to a treatment of skepticism. So it is not in the sense in which I'm putting forward, a feature of Cartesian skepticism. You said, among your features, one feature that's missing, I find, is this thing that Cavell calls truth and skepticism. But I like what Cavell says about the truth and skepticism, but it doesn't belong on my list of features. To think it belongs on my list of features, it's not just a misunderstanding of me, it's actually a misunderstanding of Cavell. It's actually a very common misunderstanding of Cavell. My 9 Cartesian features are meant to be features of the problematic, at least some of which, given the philosopher's own self-understanding of what he's doing, you can see he has. When Cavell gives his account of the truth and skepticism, that is not a description of a piece of what the skeptical philosopher thinks in terms of his own self-understanding. It's a recovery of something when it's in a position to think. Once, to borrow Hegel's word, the skeptical point of view has been alcohol. So it doesn't belong in my list of features. You're finding it absent in my list of features doesn't tell you anything about what I think about it. In fact, I think it's quite interesting. But now, maybe first one little comment. Just a little aside in connection to something you said. The disappointment in my list was not the last feature. It's not the first feature. It comes after the best case of knowledge, and it comes after the doubt. But it's a little before the middle. So I start with the beginning very carefully, but it's actually, I think, an early feature. So I don't think there's a disagreement between you and Cavell there either. But what is true, though, I think, is that in order to get the sense of the truth in skepticism for Cavell, I might put it this way, and this is the sense in which, as I said it, Cavell appreciates that Wittgenstein is working at the Kantian level, what I call the Kantian level, even if he doesn't see that there's something to mean by skepticism in its application to Kantian problem. So I think for Cavell, in this respect, he's a Kantian. Overcoming Cartesian skepticism means having a conception of human finitude that, as I put it in my lecture, is not of the Schmerz. It's not, we do not see our finitude as something to be understood in terms of it's being the case we cannot do something that we could. The way this comes out very nicely in Cavell has a very nice metaphor for this. He said, what Wittgenstein wants to show the skeptic is that human finitude should not be understood as the human being chafing against his own skin. It's very, I think, very beautiful piece of writing in Cavell. You can chafe against, if your hands are tied, or if you're in a straitjacket, or you're in chains, or rope, you can chafe against them. You can rub and try to get out them and burn your skin, trying to break the chains. But you cannot chafe against your own skin. To move your skin, you move. Your skin is the surface of you. There's no chafing against your skin. And the skeptic's picture of our confinement in the finitude of our forms of cognition is like, seeing yourself as confined by your skin. It's not, it is to see the enabling conditions of knowledge as themselves a form of confinement and shaping. And that perception of what the response the Cartesian requires has a Kantian character by my rights. So Cavell's conception of the truth in skepticism, his own story about what the truth is, interpreted in this way, actually, I think, presupposes or requires the Kantian problem. So not only, I am sympathetic to it, but I would say something else, which is, to fully see what Cavell is doing there, we need to see the Cartesian problematic as something that is dialectically related to the Kantian problematic. And therefore we cannot separate them in the way he wants to in his response to could be. So not only do I like the idea of truth and skepticism, I think a full understanding of it and the kind of role in which that perception of this Rican skepticism, explained this way, plays in a figure like Kant and Wittgenstein, is connected to their understanding of the philosophical dialectic as involving both these movements. So not only is it not missing from my account, I want to say, I think I can give a fuller story about why it's required in a treatment of skepticism. And why it's in Wittgenstein as Cavell thinks, but it's also in Kant, where Wittgenstein thinks it can't be, where Cavell thinks it can't be, because he has a Cartesian reading of Kant, I think, as many people do. But so it's not missing from my story, but it is missing from my list of features, Cartesian features, and I think it should be missing from my list of Cartesian features. I think I have a sense that there are some people that want to go home. They want to lock up this room. They're occasionally opening the door. So maybe we should liberate them. So tomorrow, we will have the lecture at 10 o'clock. Is that okay with everyone? So 10 o'clock in the morning then, we'll have the last lecture. And we will apply this apparatus that we developed the last 2 days. And I hope to show you that it can illuminate some things. Thank you very much. Oh, it was not a German word for bottle. They translate it as Wortlosigkeit, which in English just means wordlessness.
Okay.
It's not a translation. That was my point. Is that they couldn't translate it. They wound up doing something that was completely inappropriate.
Okay.
It's not even a word for a cognitive capacity.
No, okay.
Yeah, so it was just some non-translation. But I couldn't come up with a German word for it, actually. So when I was writing this, I didn't think about the fact that someone might have to translate it.
Yeah.
I give you back your USB.
Yes.
Even if what there has a little bit this connotation of even without capacity to
Right,
operate.
but the problem is that Wortlos is not the name for American. It's not the name for